Welcome to Nahanni National Park. Situated in the Northwest Territories of Canada, this national park boasts a number of spectacular views and landmarks one must simply see to believe. With picture-perfect mountain peaks, sprawling deep canyons, powerful roaring rivers, and a lush green forest to explore, it's here one can always find a place to immerse themselves in nature. But be careful not to be caught outside after dark. You may just lose your mind. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and I am incredibly excited to share this topic with all of you today. It is, of course, about the Nahanni National Park Reserve and the mysteries that can be found there. As you might have been able to figure out from the title of this episode, this will be the first part in this series, with many more to come. There's just so many strange things happening here, I would never be able to do it justice in just one episode. As I had said before in the opening, this secluded, beautiful park boasts some of the best views anyone could ever ask for in Canada. With tremendously large waterfalls branching off into rivers flowing into incredibly thick forests, all of which are looked down upon by the cloud-covered mountains, this valley attracts hundreds of visitors every year looking for an escape into nature and to leave the troubles of a fast-paced, modern-day lifestyle behind. It was back in 1978 the park was inducted as one of the world's first natural heritage sites and continues to be known as one of the most picturesque locations in the world. Remnants of an ancient inland sea from hundreds of million years ago can be found embedded in the rock formations and plateaus, leaving behind thousands of fossilized remains of the ancient sea life. There are 4 main canyons that span across the park, with some parts measuring as deep as 1,000 meters in depth. The prospectors of the late 1800s and early 1900s creatively named these canyons as Canyons 1 through 4 as they traverse through the park's thick wilderness in search of any traces of gold. These canyons are amazing to see and look at, but what really attracts people to this paradise is Virginia Falls. This thunderous waterfall nearly doubles in height of what Niagara Falls exhibits, with Niagara Falls coming in at 51 meters in height and Virginia Falls coming in at 96. The Virginia Falls sees over 100 million tons of water fall from its peak every day. Though, what many of you might be thinking at this point, well, this all sounds nice and lovely, but this amazing national park doesn't really seem like it fits with the theme of the show. Well, what many people are unaware of is that part of the Nahanni National Park goes by another name, one far more sinister because it certainly has earned this title. It is also known as the Valley of the Headless Men. Charlie McLeod looked back at his ragtag team of adventurers, taking a break after defeating a particularly difficult part of their journey. He cleared the sweat from his brow with his sleeve and stepped down off of the fallen log he had been standing on to gain a higher viewpoint, and went to join his companions in taking a break for some food and water. They had been out in those woods for several weeks now, and all were beginning to lose hope with each passing of the sun. But hope was all Charlie had left. And as he stared blankly at his newly made friends preparing their meal, the familiar feeling of being watched passed over him and was quickly replaced with worry. He hadn't seen his 2 older brothers, Willie and Frank, for around 3 years now, and with the rumors coming out of this cursed land, he'd grown desperate. A branch breaking in the distance startled the group of men into a stunned silence. They had all felt the same eyes watching them for days now, and the eerie silence that followed this feeling never failed to put them on edge. The group sat quietly, completely frozen, waiting to hear if whatever was out there was making its way in their direction. They were all hardened men, forged from the hardship the late 1800s frontier society molded them to be, but every one of them hadn't expected the wilds of the Nahanni to have broken them as it had. If it wasn't for the allure of fortune and glory, and the added upfront payment by Charlie, every single one of them would have been more than happy to stay far away from this part of the territory. They had all heard stories of the kinds of creatures who roamed these woods, but always had chalked them up to simple campfire tales used to scare young children. But after experiencing the dangers and hardships the valley had thrown at them, they were far from non-believers now. Whatever had been stalking them for the past several days, it seemed to have moved on now, and the small crew got back to preparing their meal. Charlie, however, never eased his white-knuckled grip on his rifle. He knew if the warnings about this land were true, it had been a miracle they had lasted this long. Even with the help of his younger brother Danny, the hiring of outdoorsmen, trappers, aboriginal guides, and even a couple of ex-members of the Northwest Mounted Police accompanying him, Charlie McLeod had the sneaking suspicion if he did not find his brothers soon, his fate and the fate of his hired men would be the same. Willie and Frank McLeod had departed Edmonton in the early summer of 1906 and had traveled with the partial hopes of making it to the Nahanni Valley and setting up a functioning campsite before the fall frost set in. They were on their way to the Yukon through the South Nahanni, where they would bunker down and wait out the winter until more favorable weather in the spring allowed further passage to their ultimate destination. And their reasoning for making this journey was to strike it rich in the Yukon Klondike. Though by this point there had been little gold left to be found there, the two brothers were optimistic they would find some along the way. Fate, however, would cause the pair to disappear upon venturing into the Nahanni area. Whatever fate had befallen the two, their brother Charlie was determined to find his lost brothers. Of course, though, being lost for several years would diminish many people's hopes in finding the McLeods alive and well. But both were seasoned outdoorsmen and fairly successful prospectors. Charlie knew this as he had joined his brothers on numerous expeditions in the past, and believed he would still find the two, living in a mountain paradise, warm in a wooden cabin fixed up by Frank, and with full stomachs thanks to Willie's adept skill in hunting. Though, hope was fading fast, and with each passing day the hired men grew restless and tired, making conversation around the campfire every night about turning back the way they came a common occurrence. Charlie wouldn't hear any of it though. They came to do a job and he'd be damned if he left these forests without finding his brothers. The breaking of another branch in the distance had caused the men to form a night watch among them, taking turns each night to keep an eye open for any would-be intruder. This thing that was following them, whatever it was smart enough to stay away when the men were awake and together, but all of them were very cautious about wandering off or falling behind. It had come close a few times during the night, but under the cover of darkness, it remained unidentified. Charlie and his men pushed off further into the dark canopy of trees, climbing over fallen rotten logs, through hidden passageways in the rocks, and backtracking to where they had originally left their canoes. They traveled further upriver, stopping on the beach to camp and search the surrounding area when their arms grew tired of paddling, and when their legs got tired of bushwhacking, they returned to their boats and did it all over again the next day. Eventually, by sheer luck, as the group traveled upriver, one of the trappers noticed near the water's edge a half-submerged canoe covered in thick river weeds. Finally, a clue they were on the right trail and greater chance of finding the McLeod brothers nearby. The search party beached their boat and inspected the half-submerged canoe, but bad signs only came from it. From the growing moss and grime of the water attaching itself to the canoe, it was clear it hadn't been used in a very long time. Charlie's younger brother Danny, during all of this, had wandered off a little to survey the surrounding area to see if any more clues could be discovered. It was when he was passing by some bushes further up the shoreline is where he came across the partial remains of a covered sled that had been used to pull or push supplies to different locations. It was while doing a quick inspection of it, Danny accidentally stumbled across a hastily written note etched on the side handle. "We have found a fine prospect." That's all that was written, but it was a clue that Willie and Frank were near and had both accomplished what they had come here to do, and if there was gold up ahead, surely it was enough to share. All of the men, with a new wave of excitement rushing over them they hadn't felt since the beginning of this quest, hurriedly beached their own boats and packed up their belongings to survey the area some more in hopes of finding more clues as to the whereabouts of the two lost brothers. They scoured the area looking for any trails or markings that indicated the brothers were near. Luckily for the group, most were experienced with tracking and were able to pick up the scent. There were several markings in the trees, indicating the branches had been cut at one point, most likely for fire kindling or building supplies. Other clues they came across were disturbed stones and cleared vegetation. It was obvious someone had been in this secluded and isolated area of the world, and chances are it had been Willie and Frank who had passed through at some point on their way to establish a temporary home base. Charlie and his team pushed forward, eager to find the lost pair and to finally have a comfortable place to settle down for a couple days before returning home. They brushed past the pine branches and stumbled into a small clearing against the side of a colossal rock cliff, so tall they had to crane their necks straight up to see the top. This part of the world was truly magnificent to experience, but these beautiful pines and overwhelming mountains weren't the only thing that drew the eyes of the expedition. Nestled up against the large rock wall was the black and burned remains of what used to be an old campsite. The long, cold campfire was an unfortunate find. It was clear this site had not been in use for a very long time, though this was not the leading cause for the group's demoralizing demeanor. Lying on both sides of the ash-covered logs were two skeletons, both male, still partially covered by their decomposing blankets. Identifying the bodies would prove to be a rather difficult task. With very little of the bodies left after so long in the elements, and after wild animals and insects had gotten to them, it took some time to figure out if these two skeletons really did belong to the McLeod brothers, though even with the gruesome discovery, the search party were still a little disturbed in the condition and position in which the skeletons were found in. What had really made the skeletons really difficult to identify, and what had caused most of the team to look away in horror, was the fact both of their heads were missing from the bodies, nowhere to be found. Those who couldn't stomach the sight of the two headless corpses broke off from the rest of the group to search the nearby brush for any signs of the heads, while Charlie and Danny and the two ex-Northwest Mounted police officers inspected the scene for any further clues. The positions of the bodies were just as much of a mystery as the missing heads. One still lay under their wool blanket, tucked nicely in as if still peacefully sleeping, while the other was sprawled out in the dirt and on its chest while still twisted up in their blanket, as if they had tried getting up in a quick manner, its bony arm still outstretched, reaching for a rusty long rifle still leaning up against a spruce tree. It was clear to both Charlie and Danny and the ex-officers that whatever had attacked them had done so during the night, allowing itself to have the element of surprise while the two victims had slept. The one sleeping on their back was the first to be attacked, not even getting so much as a second to react to their killer. The second one, sprawled out and away from their bed, had obviously been woken up by their partner being struck down in his sleep, and most likely took a few seconds to wake up and attempt to rush for their rifle before being struck down themselves. From what the ex-officers were able to distinguish from the scene and the bodies, whatever had attacked these two men had the intelligence to wait until the two were sound asleep before striking, then for whatever reason, cleanly removed the heads from their body after the fact and disappeared with them. Sadly, with the clues adding up, the prospecting equipment being found, and with being such an isolated area of the world, It was clear to everyone these were the two men they had set out weeks ago to find. Charlie, while looking over the bodies, was able to identify a few personal belongings like Willie's gold wedding ring and Frank's gold pocket watch, among other valuables. This then perplexed the men even more. It clearly wasn't an animal attack, and if it was done by an animal none of these outdoorsmen and trappers could fathom having this kind of intelligence to ambush these two men like it had, then to rip the heads cleanly off and carry only those away, leaving the meat of its kill behind. If it was maliciously caused by another person, where did they come from? How did they find the brothers way out here in the middle of nowhere? What reason would they have to ambush and kill them, and why hadn't they taken the very valuable and easy to carry items the two brothers still had on them? Not only this, but just a short distance away from the bodies of the brothers were still crates of supplies and food left untouched, and even more curious, a crate full of gold quartz sat safely among the rest of the supplies. This mystery was weighing heavy on everyone as nobody could offer up any kind of answer to give the grieving brothers. But another snap in the distance gave the party a brief pause. Whatever had attacked Willie and Frank might still be out there. After all, they never really did get the sense they had lost whatever eyes had been watching them since they entered this cursed valley. The two brothers hastily got to work digging two graves. There was really nothing left for them here, and they wanted to leave, but they refused to leave behind the brothers' bodies without being put to rest. Aside from the ex-Mounties, who were more interested in searching for further clues to the mystery, the rest of the men began packing the old camp supplies and crate of gold quartz into their canoes to begin their long journey out of the valley. If anything, they were going to get something for coming out this far into the wild. It was unfortunate about the brothers' deaths, but everyone half expected this to be the outcome upon their discovery of their fate. Best thing they could do is to make sure the brothers were at rest and leave as quickly as possible before whatever happened to Willie and Frank happened to the rest of them. Both Charlie, Danny, and the rest of the team ventured out of the Nahanni Valley with little to no incidents occurring. It had been a much faster journey to get out than it was to venture in, as they were all eager to leave this place behind and be done with what they had been hired to do. Upon reaching the outskirts of the wilderness, the group started to disband, going their separate ways after receiving their fair share of gold quartz they had been promised by Charlie when he hired them. Half up front, half upon completion of the job. That was the deal, and Charlie was more than thankful for everyone's help in finding his lost brothers. He knew he would have never been able to find them on his own. But with the thought in his mind of how his brothers had died, he still had a sneaking suspicion foul play had been involved, and he wanted justice. Both he and Danny headed back home to Edmonton, but made a quick stop in Fort Liard to report their case to the Northwest Mounted Police in hopes they would open up an investigation. And to the surprise of the brothers, the police did decide to get involved. 1 year later, Charlie was in the company of multiple members of the mounted police out of Fort Simpson and led them up the South Nahanni River to the crime scene. Upon arriving where Willie and Frank were buried, a thorough investigation of the scene took place, with the end conclusion being the pair had been murdered for their gold. When Willie and Frank set out on the South Nahanni years prior, they met a Scottish steamboat engineer named Robert Weir, who, after seeing the gold the brothers acquired from past trips in the area, was eager to join the two on this new expedition. The Mounties had believed it was Weir who had murdered the two brothers and made off with their incredibly large gold find, and in his haste, left behind the valuable personal items and possibly the crate of gold quartz, as he could not fit anymore into whatever he was using to transport the rest. And this was a satisfying answer for Charlie. He had met this mysterious stranger with Willie and Frank, and thought he felt a little off after seeing Weir's excitement when he laid eyes on the gold trinkets his brothers were donning. Although, a year after the investigation was completed, some new evidence was brought to light thanks to a band of local Native Americans passing through the area of the crime scene. While traveling through, they had discovered the skeleton of another man lying face down in the dirt, who had obviously been running but was struck down and died where he fell. They reported it to the police, and another quick investigation went underway as a couple of members returned to the area to retrieve the body, where they determined it to be that of Robert Weir, the lost Scotsman they believed to have been the killer. With this new revelation coming to light, theories about what could have possibly have happened to the three in those woods began spreading like wildfire to all areas of the Canadian frontier. There have been those who believe the men had simply succumbed to hunger and lack of supplies. After all, the whole reasoning for the two to have brought Robert Weir with them was because they had failed to secure proper supplies for their trip, and Weir just so happened to have the extra to spare. And remember, they were out there for quite a few years, so being in the wilderness season after season would have dwindled their supplies quickly, and if the brothers had succumbed to illness or disease, perhaps they had simply died in their sleep. This then would lead Robert Weir to attempt to travel back to civilization, where he too succumbed to illness and died alone among the trees. Now, with the fact their corpses were found headless, it had been brought up they were maybe chewed off and taken by wild animals such as wolves. This narrative could be possible, but not likely, as wolves would have taken the bodies before just taking the heads. It's interesting to think these reasons might be the cause for the condition the brothers were found in, but many disagree, most of all Charlie. Both his brothers were very experienced outdoorsmen. Having been on several prospecting trips in the past, their ability to survive in the wild was evident from their past trips. For them to have succumbed to their lack of supplies and not able to survive off the wilderness like they had done so before on previous trips was incredibly out of character. Charlie never really did believe his brothers died from the elements and was adamant until his death that Robert Weir was to blame. The story of Robert's body being found in the woods near his brothers was one he never chose to believe and clung to every rumor that a man fitting Robert's description was seen with heaps of gold in Telegraph Creek, British Columbia, or working for the Canadian National Railway near Vancouver. Those who would listen to him would often hear from Charlie for the next few decades, still trying to obtain justice for his brothers. But with very few leads to go on and conflicting stories on where Weir could have possibly been, tracking this man down took years. Though with that being said, he was able to track him down eventually. In a dingy saloon on Water Street in Vancouver, he came face to face with the man he blamed for the deaths of his brothers, buying drinks for the crowds of people with the stolen gold he pulled from his pockets. The police reports from the Nahanni were obviously wrong, and the third skeleton the natives must have found must have belonged to another victim, because he was Robert, alive and well. But none of that mattered anymore to Charlie. He had finally found who he was looking for. But instead of socking him in the face as anyone might have, he sat down and started asking questions. With a long breath of stale whiskey, Robert went into the story when he and the McLeod brothers entered the valley. They had been hunted by a group of hostile Indians from the start. Night after night, they could hear them creeping through the thick brush and ambush their small party repeatedly. It was difficult to survive in such an untamed world out there. Whenever the prospectors had built traps and gathered supplies during the day, their hunters would come and either steal or destroy them. Eventually, the three had come across a rich vein of gold, but after another close call from the ambushing natives, the three of them decided to abandon their find to head back with the hopes of returning with a larger and more prepared party. After another particularly difficult night of fending off their attackers, Robert and the brothers decided to separate, hoping to either draw off their attackers and confuse them, or at the very least, hope one of them would make it out to bring help. After dividing the gold they had found, Robert headed out west towards the mountains and Vancouver, while the brothers attempted to head to Fort Simpson. Charlie stared at him though, still having his suspicions on whether or not this had been the truth he was hearing. But wanting more information, he held his tongue and returned to that same saloon multiple times over the course of 2 weeks to squeeze more information about the brothers' massive gold find out of an inebriated Robert. There are several different accounts and versions of this tale. Some have said that with suspicion that Robert was to blame for their deaths, Charlie had gone to Vancouver first and found Robert before setting out to find his brothers. With the information he retrieved from Robert, Charlie then set out with his rescue party to find his lost brothers and to recover their gold. In another version, he had tracked Robert just outside of Wetaskiwin, Alberta, where he confronted a tired and paranoid Robert working on the railway, causing him to flee in horror upon finding out the McLeod's younger brother knew who he was and was standing in front of him. Robert took off running and Charlie had chased him to an old farmyard, where Robert had jumped into a haystack to hide. Catching just the edge of Robert's foot jump into the stack, Charlie set the hay ablaze, stepping back and watched it burn with Robert still inside. Robert then climbed to the top of the bale and shot himself in the head out of guilt. Then, in Charlie's own personal version of the events when he had found Robert, he had come across him completely by accident when he was visiting a trader just outside of Edmonton. He had randomly struck up a conversation with this gruff individual who to Charlie looked vaguely familiar. Trying to figure out who this man was, Charlie began asking him questions, where their conversation drifted to their past experiences with prospecting, then the Northern Territory, and then eventually the Nahanni Valley. By this time, the mysterious deaths of Willie and Frank McLeod were well known by anyone who had been in the area, so Charlie decided to bring them up on a hunch. The stranger in the trading post chuckled to himself a bit when asked about them and whispered, "Yeah, I know of them. I buried them myself." To which Charlie gripped Weir's arm with a grim face and said, "I sure hope you're joking, mister, 'cause I'm their brother." Surprised and horrified, Robert broke free from Charlie's grasp and fled out of the traders, taking off by horse to a farm near Viking, Alberta, where Charlie also pursued him. As he watched Charlie approach the old farm, Robert locked himself inside the wooden barn and shot himself in the head rather than give himself up to Charlie. The sparks from the ensuing shot then ignited the hay covering the ground of the barn and burned wildly while Charlie stood back and watched as the man who he believed to have killed his brothers turned to ash. These different versions detailing and describing the events of what happened to the McLeod brothers are, while conflicting, are still surrounded by real events. Willie and Frank McLeod were found decapitated in the Nahanni Valley. Charlie had gone to search for them and their lost gold with his team, and Robert Weir was blamed for much of it. The incredibly large gold mine they had discovered had been the focal point of the legend for many eager prospectors of the time, hoping to hear some news about its location. But whatever was actually out there in the Nahanni Valley was protective of its treasure, and many people believed Weir was innocent and had told the truth to Charlie. Regardless of how their deaths occurred though, the small valley the McLeod brothers were found in became famously known far and wide as the Dead Men's Valley. Even with the legend of the McLeod brothers' mysterious deaths crossing the lips of everyone on the frontier, the part of the story where the McLeods finding a fine prospect had interested more than a few brave explorers to venture into the wild, just as the McLeods had done so before. And just like the McLeod brothers, their own stories of their own demise would grow into legend. With the legend of the McLeod's adventure, lost gold, and mysterious deaths still spreading like the plague, it didn't take long after the official case was closed by the Northwest Mounted Police and publicized by the newspapers of the time before a Norwegian prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen attempted an expedition into the infamous Dead Men's Valley. Though, as is common with prospectors, they were typically selfish people, and Jorgensen had hoped to find the gold by himself. Now, this is a good idea when you're guaranteed to find some gold, but Jorgensen was practically going in blind. The only clues he had was what he had been told about where the brothers were found. There was no one guiding him, no one helping supply his expedition, and no one to watch his back while he was out there. This lack of planning and precaution is probably what would eventually lead to his demise while exploring. But don't let this cause you to think Jorgensen was incompetent. He, in fact, was a very likable character. Both white man and Indian were fond of him, and everyone claimed him to be a giant of a man who was completely capable of surviving on his own in the wild. Although gruff and stern at times, men from all over thought very highly of him. He was praised for being incredibly versed in woodworking and had a great deal of prospecting experience under his belt. He, by all accounts, would have been the one to return victorious from the woods with an incredible stash of gold. Only thing was, he was delving into the Nahanni Valley, and more specifically, Dead Man's Valley. If it were anywhere else, you could have guaranteed he would emerge from the bushes with an armful of gold-speckled quartz. But this was an untamed land, and even he, with his years of experience and overwhelming strength and size, would be tested. In the year 1909, Martin Jorgensen approached the edge of a protruding rock and overlooked the land he was ready to conquer. Such a vast and pristine valley would surely hold enough secrets and untouched resources ripe for his discovery. He knew from the legend that he needed to make it to the South Nahanni River and follow it up north to get close to where the brothers had been found dead. From that point, he could survey the area and hunt for the fine prospect that was mentioned in the story and supposedly written by either Willie or Frank before they died. It wasn't easy trekking through this part of the world, but with the help from a few old-time friends, Poole Field and Billy Atkinson, Jorgensen was able to secure supplies and a proper heading. Things between Field and Atkinson were complicated, to say the least. During Jorgensen's journey, Atkinson had been sent to prison for manslaughter, and his wife, a Métis woman named Mary, who didn't have the means to support herself at the time, moved in with their friend Poole Field, who eventually married her, apparently with Billy Atkinson's blessing. Jorgensen had been gone for just over 3 years now, and with no sign or word of the man, his friends believed him to be either lost, dead, or gone somewhere to enjoy the good fortune he managed to find. That is until one day, an out-of-breath courier traveled to the Pelly Lakes trader in the Yukon with a letter addressed to Atkinson. Although because he was still in a Mountie jail, his ex-wife Mary accepted the letter while she was visiting with her new husband, Poole Field. According to the courier, he had been paid quite handsomely with enough gold quartz to fill his pockets to deliver this single, crudely written letter. The massive white man had given him specific instructions to make sure this filthy paper note made it to the hands of his friends in hopes they would read it and come for him. On the dirt-covered paper was a map showing a drawing of a crude cabin located a mile upriver from the mouth of a rock flat, and a short message written under the drawing instructing Atkinson to come as quickly as he could. Jorgensen had struck it rich. Due to him being still held in a Mountie jail at the time, Poole Field took it upon himself to replace Atkinson and decided he would be the one to go help his large friend in the valley. He went to the jail to discuss his plan with his friend, and Atkinson instructed him to stake a claim in his own name and to use his connections and resources to supply an outfit to travel to the Nahanni to meet Jorgensen and recover the treasure he found. In 1914, Poole recruited a Dene guide named Oscar, who at the time was incredibly knowledgeable in the area Jorgensen was supposed to be around. So the two men packed their things and headed off into the wild Nahanni to spend the next few seasons searching for Jorgensen and hunting for the treasure he had found. The pair made the long trek across the vast and rocky Yukon mountains and entered into the Nahanni Valley, where they headed down south the long and winding South Nahanni River, down to near the Virginia Falls, where the two would go on to make camp and wait out the winter. Being so far north and in a mountainous area, the snow would make it near impossible to venture any further and made it excruciatingly difficult to survive. So, the best bet was to just hunker down for the next few months and establish a base camp. However, they were in the area Jorgensen's note told them to go, but there was no sign of him. The two spent the next few months hunting and collecting pelts. They figured if they couldn't find Jorgensen that winter, their trip wouldn't be a total loss and could bring back the pelts to sell. And as the time went on, the bitter mountain air continued to get to them. It made their stay quite miserable. Unfortunately, they had gotten to their destination a little late in the year and weren't able to establish a small cabin for them to stay in, so both Poole and Oscar had to live in their small tents, most likely which were packed full of animal pelts to try and stave off the frozen air from getting inside. At the first sign of spring, the pair packed up their gear and departed the valley, failing at their main goal of finding Jorgensen. This, however, was definitely not the end, and Poole was a determined man. The following year, and probably a little earlier than before, he ventured back over the mountains to search for his long-lost friend still trapped in the Nahanni. This time, his search party was a little bigger. Although some believe he traveled alone in the Nahanni on his second trip, many more believed he was accompanied by Oscar again, his wife Mary, a trapper named Olaf Bedvik, and a freshly released Billy Atkinson, who was more than eager to travel with Poole to both enjoy his newfound freedom and to strike it rich. The group had traveled back to where Poole and Oscar had established their camp the year prior. The winter was still far off, so they decided to stay in the area a little while to restock their food supplies and to fix any broken tools that might have been damaged during their journey. Along the way, they had done some light prospecting and were able to come across some good colors in the streams. As it's fairly rare to find flakes of gold in the streams anywhere else, this encouraged the group even more to believe the amount of gold to be found in the valley was untouched and was plentiful. After a few days of recovering, luck would continue to show its head for the group. They stumbled upon a small, crudely built cabin, one matching the description on Jorgensen's note that told them how to find it. Although Jorgensen was nowhere to be found, and after a few days of waiting around, wondering if he would show up, the group pushed forward, further into the valley. The note had described Jorgensen had built several cabins at different points. He had, after all, been out there for roughly around 6 years now, and certainly would have had time to establish multiple camps as he himself traversed and pushed further in. The group continued on, with high hopes they would find Jorgensen at the next cabin, one of which hopefully was packed full of gold. With thoughts of the shimmering rock awaiting them, the search party hurried forward and after a couple days of hiking, eventually found an obvious trail leading into the heart of the valley, one that had been walked up and down a few times, with branches and bushes cleared away. According to the note, this path should lead them straight to Jorgensen's main cabin, the one he had been doing most of his prospecting out of. With the open trail now offering up easier passage through the forest, the group was able to venture easily and quickly through it, making good time and eventually coming face to face with Jorgensen's prospecting camp. Though immediately, they were met with something far more disturbing than they had anticipated. Any enthusiasm or pleasant thoughts they had quickly diminished as they looked down at the remains of Jorgensen's cabin, which was now nothing more than blackened logs and ash. Nothing inside had remained intact that would show what would have caused the fire, nor were any clues showing how long ago it happened. And with Jorgensen nowhere to be found, the party quickly began searching for his remains under the ashes, thinking perhaps maybe he was caught inside while it burned. Thankfully, no human bones were found in or around the spot where the cabin once stood, meaning there was still a chance Jorgensen had moved on and built another cabin somewhere else. But with no other markings or clues as to which direction he might have gone, Poole decided it was worth the time and effort to look around and survey the area for their lost friend. At the very least, maybe he would be able to find some of the lost treasure Jorgensen had mentioned in his note, but of course his main concern was for his friend. The others joined him on his search, eager and worried to find their friend and whatever condition he might have been in if there was an accident. They spread out a bit, picked a direction, and headed out, though the search didn't last long. About 65 yards away from the burnt-down cabin, just beyond eyesight and collapsed on the ground, was the body of their large friend. He had died clutching his rifle, with 2 spent shells on the grass beside the body, obviously having been shot at something. In some variations of the story, his rifle was also twisted and bent, meaning something incredibly strong had grabbed it and forcibly destroyed it after it had been used. It was clear to everyone their longtime friend, who was a giant of a man, had been in a battle for his life. But the most disturbing part that caused every member of the group to have flashbacks to the original legend of the MacLeod's deaths was that Jorgensen's head was nowhere to be found. This scene horrified everyone, and questions quickly arose as to what could have possibly have done this. Nobody really had any clue, but all were instantly put on edge and became much more cognizant of movement and noises around them. As one could expect, even the flapping of birds from one branch to another or a squirrel darting into the bushes made everyone jumpy, and for the next several hours left in the day, they all took turns on watch. They had spent a few more days at the isolated camp, restocking their supplies and searching for the lost treasure, but their luck had seemingly dried up after finding the corpse of their friend, and unfortunately, they walked away empty-handed. It would be known after their return trip, Poole, being an ex-Mountie himself, had discussed his findings with the Northwest Mounted Police. He wanted to report his findings, but also to let them know there was no need for an investigation, as he had conducted his own in the following days after finding Jorgensen's body, and found no clues or explanations as to what could have happened to his friend. The Mounties at Fort Simpson were more than satisfied with his findings, as they knew Poole and they trusted his word. Plus, having to assign several Mounties and supply them for an expedition to where Jorgensen was buried was time-consuming and expensive. Poole also wanted to warn the Mounties of Fort Simpson that if they did end up traveling to the area, to keep their eyes and ears open. There was something hiding in those woods watching the group, and everyone had felt those eyes on them as they departed. As word of Jorgensen's decapitation began to spread, and with the added history of similar deaths of Willie and Frank McLeod happening a few years prior, further suspicions surrounding the valley began to spread across Western Canada. Rumors of a massive gold find yet to be discovered was enticing to every prospector around, but there were only a very limited number of people who would be brave enough to search for it. Everyone knew of the dangers of the Nahanni Valley, but very few actually knew what those dangers actually were. Dead Man's Valley was strictly avoided by anyone passing near the area, and even then many trappers and prospectors wouldn't dare to venture into the Nahanni altogether, despite the promise of it being a rich land. Over time, as the legend grew, the warnings the prospectors would share of Dead Man's Valley would grow so much, it earned a new name, the Headless Valley. The McLeod brothers and Martin Jorgensen weren't the first victims of the Nahanni Valley. Merely, they were some of the first famous prospectors to have gone missing and then found dead under mysterious circumstances. The curse of the Nahanni Valley has been known to be around for hundreds, if not thousands of years before the prospectors' fateful journeys into the wild land. The nearby Dene tribe of the Liard River area have shared oral stories for hundreds of years of many hunters going missing in the Nahanni, never to return. Members of the Dene Nation, whenever possible, would avoid the Nahanni Valley at all costs, only having ventured inside the isolated oasis for hunting when winters had become too harsh for wild game to be available to hunt. Every chance they could, they would warn prospectors who were driven enough to look for their fortune in the valley of the dangers that lurked within, though very few would take their words seriously and chalked it all up to native superstition. Years before the McLeod brothers entered the Forbidden Valley, a group of adventurous prospectors traveled into the Nahanni back in 1897 as a form of shortcut to get to the Yukon Klondike. However, they never arrived on the other side of the mountain pass, and the only evidence of their journey were crudely built cabins scattered throughout the valley. Their fate would never be known, and the only way we know of their existence and travels were from the reported findings of two other travelers, Raymond Patterson and Gordon Matthews, 30 years after they had disappeared. They had this to say about their findings. There was an eerie, uncanny feel to them that could not be wholly accounted for by the silence of the place, hidden away up this snye and removed from all the rush and turmoil of the fast water, or by the dark old trees with their long gray-green streamers of moss that swayed in ghostly fashion at the faintest whisper of a breeze. There was something wrong about those cabins. Something bad happened there to those men who built them. Time would go on, and prospector after prospector would disappear or wind up dead. The curse the local Native Americans maintained about the disturbing lost gold would seem to be true, as anyone who ventured in with the intent of recovering the lost gold yet to be taken from this valley would meet a terrible fate. Ideas among what could possibly be out there guarding the treasure crossed the minds of all prospectors who had the idea of taking the risk. Was it a deadly spell, made from an aboriginal shaman meant to keep white people from disturbing his tribe's land and way of life? Was it a supernatural entity who drifted through the trees at night, preying on anyone foolish enough to venture near? Or was it a deadly, bloodthirsty creature who stalked the woods and mountains, hunting any human who dared enter its territory? Whatever the cause for these violent and gruesome deaths, it was enough to discourage hundreds of prospectors and adventurers from risking their lives for the small chance of finding something valuable. So for the most part, for the next few years, very few people traveled into the Nahanni. That is, until early 1920s, when a fur trapper named John O'Brien established a small outpost for himself and friends just a short distance upriver from the Nahanni Butte along Jackfish River. Billy Clark, another prospector/trapper, was good friends with him and believed O'Brien hailed from around Peace River, a small town in northern Alberta. John O'Brien was a veteran of the Great War, a hardened man who survived numerous battles of World War I, only to finally meet his match and eventual fate among the rocks and pines of the Nahanni. It was on January 27th of 1922 when O'Brien departed the small cabin he constructed to inspect some traps he had laid throughout the valley in hopes of finding some wild game he had caught. According to legend, he turned to his partner who had decided to stay at the cabin that day, that he would be returning a little more than a week after making his rounds. His partner waited for him to return, but after 10 days of waiting and O'Brien never showing up, he left the cabin to report him missing. It wouldn't be until over a month later did two men, Jack LaFleur and a Métis woodman, Jonas Lafferty, who had been well acquainted with O'Brien and thought of him as a friend, heard about him missing and set off to find him, as they were in the general area of the Nahanni Valley. They believed if he needed help, they would do their best to search and support their friend, and considering it would take several more months before the Mounties would set up a search for the man, they would take it upon themselves to look for him. It was obvious both were incredibly determined to find their lost friend, as both of them had to traverse the frozen landscape by snowshoe and travel up north across mountains and thick forests to even get to the Nahanni. Eventually, though, after entering the valley and spending several weeks searching for O'Brien, they did indeed manage to find him. Of course, though, not in the state they were hoping for. Sitting next to a long dead campfire sat the frozen body of John O'Brien, with a blanket draped around his back and shoulders, and a single match and tinderbox still in his hand, as if he had died just seconds before striking another match. It was as if O'Brien had been flash frozen, still trying to desperately get a spark of fire at the very moment of his death. The scene was haunting to look at for his two would-be rescuers. Both LaFleur and Lafferty knew about the horrors this valley brought. O'Brien, as tough as he was, even after experiencing and surviving the horrors of the Great War, wasn't even a match for whatever curses or entity that dwelled out there. The fact that he had been frozen in place, still holding the matches and tinderbox, gave the two men a sense of terror, leaving them to wonder if the weather had in fact been this cold to have done this to a man, or if it was maybe something else that had caused this. The two didn't really want to stick around to find out which one of those would be the death of them as well, so they promptly tried to bury their friend, which proved to be rather difficult as the ground was still frozen and covered in snow. But as soon as they did, the two of them departed the valley as quickly as they both could, and swore to remember their brave fallen friend. Where O'Brien had been buried, they would go on to name the site as O'Brien's Mountain, in honor of their departed friend who passed away under circumstances that disturbed everyone who heard the news. There's another strikingly similar story to that of Martin Jorgensen's, about what happened roughly around the same time to another giant of a man known as the Yukon Fisher. He was reportedly so large of a man he would tower over anyone who stood near him. With a short fuse and the raw strength he carried on his shoulders, it caused him to become an intimidating figure. This is why I find his story so fascinating. In a small, unknown Yukon saloon, Fisher had somehow found himself in an altercation with the bartender. As their argument dragged on and became more heated, one thing eventually had led to another, and Fisher took one swing with a whiskey bottle and split the bartender's head clean open. Shocked at what he had just done and just how much blood there was, he attempted to avoid a hanging by taking off into the wilderness, where he would live as an outlaw on the outskirts of society. In total isolation, he would survive alone, avoiding both Indians and white men who traveled near, and only would venture to isolated trading posts to avoid being caught or recognized by anyone. He was an opposing figure after all, and if he was a wanted man, he would be pretty easy to spot. Poole Field just so happened to own one of those isolated trading posts where the Yukon Fisher would stop by a couple times a year. He claimed Fisher would occasionally appear in his trading post, trading gold for certain supplies like tea, ammunition, or rations. According to Poole, Fisher had developed the skills of a wild animal. After having lived for years in such a primitive way, he would reportedly be able to extinguish the smells and sounds of a moose, caribou, bears, whatever was walking through the woods. He was able to track any animal and take it down with ease. He was by all means a man of the wild. After so many of these years living in the wild, dealing with his guilty conscience, something good actually happened to him. Although he never abandoned his way of life, his conscience would eventually be relieved when a courier managed to track the man down and informed him he was indeed a free and innocent man. The bartender he had struck with a bottle and believed he had killed all those years ago somehow managed to survive the beating Fisher had dealt him, and that Fisher was able to return to society without worry of his past sins catching up with him. He, of course, didn't have any desire to return to modern society. Perhaps it was self-guilt for other sins we are not aware of. Maybe it was out of fear he wouldn't be able to transition himself back into the world of man, or simply he might have just liked living in the wild. Whatever the case, the giant Yukon Fisher remained in the Northwest Territory, and more specifically, hung around the Nahanni Valley up until his death at an unknown time. Although I wouldn't be sharing his story if the curse of the Nahanni Valley didn't have some play in his death. Just like the fate of his brothers, Charlie McLeod and his group of explorers managed to come across the remains of a headless giant man, one who had his head cleanly cut from his body, roughly to which they guessed was 15 years prior, and who had seemingly died fighting, just as Martin Jorgensen would do a few years later. Beside the headless giant was the destroyed remains of a .44-40 carbine rifle. The barrel of the rifle easily bent around to render it completely unusable or salvageable. Although there is little proof this was the famous giant known as the Yukon Fisher, many of the frontiersmen of the time believed it was indeed him, and he had befallen a terrible fate at the hands of something more deadly and far stronger than he was. Jumping back ahead a bit, a short time after the disappearance and then eventual death of John O'Brien, would another person vanish while delving into the Nahanni. The woman in question was May Lafferty, a younger cousin of Mary Field, Poole Field's wife. Most who knew May would describe her as a strange girl, one who was known to be apparently quite neurotic at some times. She had quite a bit of experience traveling, prospecting, and hunting, as often she would accompany Poole and Mary whenever they went out to do one of these three things. It was when she accompanied Poole and Mary and a party of Nahanni Indians on a journey through the Nahanni country that her tragic story would become known. The large group had been traveling through the Mackenzie Mountains and down towards one of the trading posts on the Mackenzie or Liard rivers. May had reportedly been acting fairly strange during this part of the journey when they had entered the valley, and from the sounds of it became quite depressed and homesick, wishing she was back at Fort Simpson where she was from. As the group had been nearing the third canyon in the valley, Mary had noticed her younger cousin had disappeared from the group, but simply thought she had perhaps wandered off to answer nature's call and would eventually catch back up with them. But as the day dragged on and still no sign of her appeared, Mary instructed Poole to take a couple men and to backtrack to go find her. Fearing her young cousin had become lost in this dreaded land, Mary paced back and forth biting her nails, wondering when her husband would return with May in tow. The men Poole had taken along with them were incredibly talented and experienced hunters and trackers, all of whom collectively held over 1,000 hunts under their belts. Poole, who was a competent and experienced hunter himself, found he couldn't even compare with the 5 native men he took along with him. They had all grown up living in and off the wild, spent hundreds of days and nights tracking wild animals, and they had no problem finding and tracking the young girl's trail a little ways back. The small group traveled in search for the young girl, who seemed continuously to move swiftly through the heavy foliage of the forest. Larger concern for the girl arose when the native trackers were finding her tracks had picked up speed, and broken branches and pressed down plants on the ground indicated she was running for some reason. They assumed she was running out of panic from being lost, but when they found the shredded remains of clothing hanging from tree branches and on top of large bushes, caused more confusion among the search party. The mosquitoes this time of year were unbearable, even to those fully clothed, and for this girl to have stripped completely naked by this point, but continued running up towards the mountains, had most of the party wonder if something had been after her. What else could have been the cause for this sort of behavior? May knew how to survive in the wilderness from her past expeditions, but she was doing everything wrong. Everything she had learned growing up and what Mary and Poole had taught her, she was doing the opposite. Tracking is hard work, and by this rate, Poole and his men were nowhere close to getting to where she was or where she was going. In Dick Turner's book titled Nahanni, he writes about his life living on the frontier and life around Fort Simpson, where May had also grown up, and he had given a description of the journey Poole and his men had while tracking her. He writes this: "By now she had gotten into rugged country, where she had to do some very steep climbing. She must have been without fear, for she climbed some cliffs where the men were afraid to go, and had to go away around to pick up her trail on top. About the 5th day, the hunters came to the bottom of a very rugged high cliff, which was actually the side of a 5,000-foot mountain. Her tracks were visible at the bottom, but they could find no sign that she had turned to the left or the right. Poole said there was just no way that any sane person could possibly have gone up that wall of rock. There was an indication that she might have tried, for there was a narrow shelf-like ledge up for 100 feet or so. Some of them went part way up, but turned back. Poole thought for sure they had come to the end of the trail, but they worked their way around to the top, and sure enough, there was her track again, heading south and east. Sane or not, she was heading in the direction of her home, which was Fort Simpson. For 4 more excruciating days, the group of men traveled in search for the missing girl before finally coming to the conclusion she did not want to be found and was lost. Poole and his group made the long trek back through the wilderness and met back up with Mary and the rest of the traveling band. Of course, Mary was distraught in learning her cousin was alone in this isolated place. During the entirety of the week and a half May had disappeared, and her husband had been gone searching for her, Mary had slept very little. She knew this land was full of danger. Most of it was unknown, but some of it, well, was too horrifying to think of. After having waited around a few extra days, hoping May would eventually come to her senses and return to the camp, the traveling band would conclude she would not be returning, and packed up their things and promptly left the valley. Upon returning home, and over the next few years, Mary and Poole would often visit Fort Simpson, in hopes of finding their young cousin safely and happily waiting at home. But as the years continued to pass by and she never appeared again, they gave up hope and accepted that she became another legend of the Nahanni. In her memory, the creek where she had disappeared from was named May Creek in honor of her, and to this day, the location where she went and why she abandoned and retreated from the expedition remains a mystery, likely never to be solved. The fates of Willie and Frank McLeod, Martin Jorgensen, John O'Brien, the Yukon Fisher, and May are all unsolved mysteries. Despite some claiming to have an idea of what might be happening here, the fact is these deaths and disappearances are just as unexplainable to this day as they were back 100 years ago. But don't be fooled, we are not remotely close to being done with this topic. We will be delving into further suspicious deaths and disappearances that took place and continue to take place in this isolated oasis, and talk further about the deadly curse shrouding the dark corners of this valley. And of course, also investigate what might be lurking out there among the spruce and pine trees, hunting anyone brave or foolish enough to venture in. So stay tuned for the next episode to hear further stories about weird disappearances and unexplainable deaths. To catch the next episode, hit the follow or subscribe button on whatever app you're listening on, and receive updates by following the podcast Instagram page at Moonlight Lore Podcast. As always, your listening supports the podcast greatly, but also giving the podcast a 5-star review on iTunes and by following or subscribing helps bring the show further up the podcast charts for other people to find. Sharing the show with your friends and family is another way that supports the show, but of course I appreciate you just listening, so thank you. As always, take care, and I'll see you next week.